Hi again, everyone. Today we're going to be doing three different things. We'll be looking at definitions, and then we'll look at a bit of comma splices, and then we'll end off with the works cited. And so, as I said, we're kind of getting you ready now, to actually put the entire paper together. And so, in this lecture, which again, I'm not quite sure how long it'll go, the lecture is more or less made up of smaller things that you want to think about as you put your paper together. Okay? I just said that, didn't I? But what I mean is, when it comes to definition, I'll be showing you things. For instance, let's just say on page 4 of your essay, you use a word, okay, you include a word that maybe isn't familiar to all of your readers, okay? One of my favorites is the word somnambulist, okay? So, you introduce the word somnambulist on page 4. It's the only time you introduce it in the paper. Should you define that? Simply because it's kind of an uncommon word? Well, the answer is no. No. Sometimes it's up to the reader to figure out, what words mean, right? Like get a dictionary, look it up, all right? So all I want to show you here, and again, maybe 20 minutes, I want to show you where do we define, why do we define, and how do we define. Those are basically the aspects that we're going to look at. So, and like I said, then we'll look at comma splices, and then we'll look at the works cited. So, let's think for a moment about what a definition is, okay? Communication between the reader and the writer cannot take place unless there's a kind of shared understanding of the writer's words, of the writer's meaning. And so, knowing when to define words is critical, especially when it comes to essays, all right? And so, there's two different ways that we can go about defining. Now, I don't think I need to spend a lot of time with you on what is called, there's a second way of doing it called extended definition. I don't think we need to worry about that, all right? Extended definition would be when we need to actually write an entire essay on maybe what a word means, like the history of a word and all of that, right? Instead, I think for our purposes, all we need to worry about is what is known as a formal definition. So, okay, just to repeat, so the short way of defining is formal definition, the long way is extended definition. But again, I'm not worried about that. I don't think we need to worry about that. So, formal definitions. All right. You explain, maybe in a sentence, right, one sentence, what a word means. Oh, but wait. When I say what a word means, well, where exactly, okay, are we looking at when it comes to the essay? Let's say you have an ambiguous word, or a word that could have many different meanings, all right? And it's in your thesis. Well, if it's in your thesis, that means that it's probably important and crucial for the rest of the argument. So, okay, if you have a word like that, you must define it. You must make it very clear to the reader, what do you mean by that word or term, okay? And so, notice what we have here. Whenever you introduce an ambiguous word or a concept, okay, whenever you assign a particular meaning, okay, to a general term, I'll give you a good example in just a moment. If it's in the thesis, then you've got to define it. And if it's in the thesis, then where would you define it? This is really, like, I don't know, I didn't know how to finish that thought. But if you've got it in your thesis, there's no point in holding off on defining it on page 3, right? Why would you do that? You would define it in the second paragraph of your essay. The first paragraph after your introduction. That's where you define. So, for instance, many of you in your first papers might be writing on ideas that you took from Lacan. Well, you don't want to hold off on defining those things, right? Instead, you've got to define them right away. So set up, and the term that I use, and I'll probably write it on some of the essays, and I probably wrote it on your outlines, set up your foundation. What is the foundation of the argument? Okay, how have you built the foundation, how have you built the argument, okay, that allows you to work it through? And so, as I said, we will have a formal definition, okay, if need be. I mean, not every essay will need that, but like I said, if you have a term that you need to define, let's think about a word. I could give you 100 words right now. Globalization, right? Freedom, justice. There's so many words like that that can have certain meanings to different individuals. Irony. There's a perfect word when it comes to an English essay, okay? So irony. Well, irony has many different meanings. So how exactly are you utilizing it in your paper? I don't know if it'll apply for our papers in this course, but if it did, right, then you want to think about that. Okay? All right. So we have a word or concept, something from Lacan, lack, right? I mean, some of you are probably working on that in your papers. So if you have the notion of lack, well, what exactly do you mean by that? Well, then the definition would go in the second paragraph, okay, after, like the first paragraph after your introduction. So remember back to something else we talked about. You don't want to have your definitions in your introduction. That's not how you do it, all right? Again, when we talked about the whole idea of intros and conclusions and all of that, no quotes in your intro, okay? All that stuff starts in the body paragraphs, all right? So, as I said, first paragraph after your introduction, boom, right away, that's where you start defining. So notice once again, we're building our paper, okay? I'm trying to show you how everything falls into place. So if you go back to your outlines, right, we talked a bit about structure there, and then now we're seeing where definitions fit in. And like I said, it all kind of comes together. And so that then sets us up for a couple of other things that we should think about. It's interesting, notice in the notes, the word define actually comes from the Latin. Okay, I've given you the word there, and it literally means to put a fence around. And so think about it. When you're putting a fence around, it means setting up the parameters of meaning. That's it, right? What do you mean by that term? And so, like I said, that's crucial. I'll give you a really good example. Globalization. Globalization can mean one thing to someone who is on the right wing of the political spectrum, and a totally different thing to someone who's on the left wing of the political spectrum, right? And so and like I said, I don't think a term like that is going to come up in your papers, but you always want to be aware of that. What exactly do you mean by the terminology that you are utilizing? Okay, so, 7.5 minutes in, and I think we've made the point on that. So let's just do a quick review. So I'm going to define if I have a word in, and by the way, to get an A, you really should have terms in your thesis, right, which need definition. Like I said, lack from Lacan, okay, or desire, or whatever. So what exactly do you mean by those terms, right? And then, as I said, in the second paragraph, right, like the first paragraph after your introduction, I'm trying to be as clear as I can. First paragraph after your introduction, then you set up the terms of argument. All right, that's it. So set up the terms of definition. Define the terms that you are utilizing, right? And so remember, if it's in the thesis, okay, then you really should do that. If it's a word that pops up on page 4 and you only use it once, no. Sometimes, as I said, I'm repeating, I know, but it's up to the reader to pick up a dictionary and figure it out. Okay? All right. So, speaking of dictionaries, that's the next thing I want to talk about. Where do we find our definitions? Well, in high school, and I know, again, please don't email me, well, you're insulting me because I've been out of high school, whatever. All I'm saying is, you were probably shown in high school to use a dictionary when it came to definitions. As you get more sophisticated in your writing, and as you move on in your academic careers, right, you'll probably move away from standard dictionaries, and you'll start utilizing reference material, okay, reference text. When I go to write on literature, right, I don't go to a dictionary to find definitions for certain terms. I would actually go to one book that I have is called the Encyclopedia of Literary Theory. And so no matter what discipline you're in, Okay, I know many of you are in English, but no matter what discipline you're in, there are reference texts for all of you, right? And so, not a bad idea to start, looking up stuff like that. Professors will refer to those types of things as you go through your academic careers. And so, as I said, the one that I have on the course outline is the Broadview glossary of literary terms, but it's not the best. It's not the best. I only put it on there simply because I was supposed to have something to give you some guidance, but like I said, I didn't ask you to buy it or anything like that. For the purposes of our course, it will be acceptable if you ever need to define a word or what have you. You can simply go to the Oxford English Dictionary. If you're going to use a dictionary at all, that's the one to use, right? The OED. But as I said, as you move along in your university career, you won't be using stuff like that. You'll be using reference manuals, okay? In other words, books that are simply tailored to your discipline. That's all I mean by that, okay? But think about it. For our first paper, if you're using Lacan, well then there's no point in going to the Oxford English Dictionary. There's no point in going to any dictionary, right? You would simply define however you're using your terminology from the article that I had on Aries. There you go. All right. So there's your foundation. All right. But as I said, as you get more and more sophisticated, right? As you move along, right? You won't be using dictionaries anymore. If you're looking to get, high grades, all right? And so, yeah, I've kind of covered that. Now, it's interesting that there may be a whole theory, like as I said, Lacan, or maybe you're using Freud, or whoever you're using, or if you're using anything like that at all. But it's also important to realize that you could write an entire paper based on one word. And so notice in the notes there, right? We have the word etymology. Notice I bolded that on page 2 at the top, right? And so basically, there are many words. You'd be amazed. I mentioned this, I think, in the introductory lecture, but you'd be amazed if you go back and look at certain words, okay, what they actually mean. Carnival, okay, pride, truth. Oh boy, there's a big one right there, truth. When we get to the handsomest round man in the world, which will be for the second paper, perhaps, right? If you choose to do that one, the whole notion of truth, that's a really interesting word when you go back and look at its history, its etymology, right? It goes back to the Greeks, and it means something very different from what we think of it today. So anyway, as I said, and like as we move through, if you're an English major, right? You'll notice in the notes there that you'll become wordsmiths. In other words, you'll be very conscious of the words that you choose. And so, and it's kind of, as I said, it's fascinating when you actually look back at what certain words meant at one time, how they've changed over the years. And I will certainly go through that with you, as I said, when it comes to the notion of truth. It's really interesting. All right, I'll give you just a tiny sample right now. It's kind of connected to Halloween in a weird way, right? The notion of truth, when we look at it from the Greeks, okay, from Greek antiquity, it has to do with concealing, hiding, right, and revealing. Well, think about it. Well, revealing, so hidden and then revealed. It's interesting then when all of a sudden these terms get into the hands of the church, right, in Rome. Well, all of a sudden now, revealing, revelation, to reveal. It's really cool. So, but as I said, we'll get into that later on. I just want to give you a taste. All right, that was just a taste. Okay. Anyway, so but it's very important. Notice what I have there in the notes. It's your meaning that you need, okay, to give to the reader. The reader shouldn't have to be figuring out, well, what do you mean by this term? You keep throwing the word globalization at me. By the way, globalization won't come up in this course. I just mean it's a perfect word when it comes to this idea how it can have two very different meanings, positive or negative, right? And if you keep throwing it out, the reader doesn't know, well, what do you mean by that? Or like, according to the reader, if the reader has a different political view than you, if you didn't define what you meant, the reader will be thinking, you're using this term incorrectly. That's all I'm getting at. All right? So be aware, okay? Be aware. And then obviously you want to avoid using, you want to avoid using the term that you're trying to define in your definition, right? In other words, I think I have there, yeah. Adolescence is the state of being an adolescent. That doesn't really help the reader, does it? Right? So, but I think you guys know that. That's what's called a circular definition. All right? So anyway, watch out for that. Okay. So all I'm trying to say here, and I think I might just take a quick pause here before we do comma splices, but you basically, as it says in the notes, right? A good definition establishes clearly, logically, and precisely the boundaries of meaning. That's it. So we set up our meaning to begin with, right? In our introduction and then in the first body paragraph. So we set up our foundation. Once we have our foundation, then we can utilize and just use terms throughout, right? Because we've made our meaning clear, right? That's it, all right? And so, as we've talked about before, you don't want to put a word in quotations, okay, or like just put a word in quotations and then just leave it like that. And you also don't want to put it in italics. The minute you think that you feel the need to do that, chances are you probably need a definition. Right? Like remember we talked about that whole idea that subconsciously, your brain is telling you, right, that this is important. Remember I talked about that before? Well, then be aware of that too. Okay? So like I said, I'm not saying that the only time you will ever define is in the beginning of the paper. If you see, and I mean each paper is going to be different. I can't give you the magical solution, but if you notice that there is another term that you tend to be using throughout and could be ambiguous, well obviously then you want to make sure you define that as well. My only point was simply if you have a big word that maybe a lot of people don't use in common day language, the vernacular, right? Well, you don't have to define those, okay? Because, as I said, that's up to the reader. But if you do notice that you're utilizing a certain word, okay, or an idea, well, then obviously you need to define that as well. I'm just trying to show you the one place where you always need to define, and that would be an ambiguous term, or, as I said, a term that perhaps is unfamiliar, right? And lack, right? Okay, there you go, right there, lack from Lacan. Well, then, boom. You do it immediately in the second paragraph, right? Don't wait. That's all I'm trying to say. And for some reason, I get email about this, right? Students get confused. So let me just repeat that, all right? You would definitely do it there, right? So you have a term in your thesis, okay? In your thesis, concept, term, and it's maybe an unfamiliar idea. Okay, then define it. Set up the foundation of your argument. And then maybe there's, another term or concept that seems to be flowing throughout your paper and is central to the rest of the argument. Well, obviously, then you would define that as well. But don't feel as though you have to just define a word simply because it's a big word and no one uses it, right? Again, that's up to the reader. All right. I hope I showed you the difference there. Okay. Cool. All right. And so, yeah. I think that's it. Let me just pause for a moment, right? Well, actually, I don't even need to pause. Let's talk now a bit about comma splices. Well, you can always pause anytime you want, right? But let's talk a bit about comma splices, okay? We're not going to do too much with comma splices. A comma splice, this is really difficult to catch in your writing. Really difficult to catch. They're grammatical errors that join two complete sentences with a comma. Okay? You fuse two complete sentences, right? And you separate them with a comma. You can't do that. And so, the example I gave, if you remember back to the comma rules that I gave you, okay? We're getting closer to your paper now, right? To your first paper, so we want to fine-tune things. That's what we're doing here. So, if you remember back, your rules on the comma, right? If you remember when I showed you the word however, remember I talked a bit about that? That's exactly what we're talking about here. And however is one of the big style killers when it comes to this whole idea of comma splices. And so the question then becomes, how do I know when I have a comma splice? Well, my notes, like the explanations are kind of clear, but the context is not. And what I mean by that is it's really difficult for you to catch your own comma splices. Why? And this isn't going to make a lot of sense to some of you. When you edit your paper, you will edit it from beginning to end. Right? I mean, that's the way we edit. That's the worst way to edit. Because when you edit from beginning, when you start reading your paper from beginning to the end, it's going to sound fine. That's the way you wrote it. That's the way it sounded in your head. Everything's going to be, you won't catch anything. Instead, what you should do, there's two different things I could suggest here. One, when you're editing a paper, and if you're looking for comma splices, if in high school you were told you have a problem with comma splices, the way you fix that, don't begin at the beginning when you're editing your paper. Just choose random sentences. Random, literally. Just to see, okay, do I have a subject in this sentence? Right? Is everything in there a subject and a verb? And quite often, by the way, you'll be missing a subject when it comes to a comma splice. Right? Quite often. I probably shouldn't have said that. I just confused some of you. But anyway, so watch out for that. All right? Or like I said, or do you have two complete sentences and you put a comma in place? You won't catch it if you're reading it from beginning to end, but if you just isolate sentences and look at them, then you have a better chance of catching comma splices. All right? I have a funny feeling I confused you there. So instead, let's just take a look at an example, right? Let's clarify. Okay. Joey went to the I'm on top of page 3 now. Joey went to the grocery store, comma, he needed to buy eggs for supper. That's what we call a comma splice. So notice, the comma, spliced, okay, that's a word that's actually kind of gotten out of usage in the language. A splice, if you ever think of film, we used to splice film, right? Putting pieces of film together if you were making a movie, right? And so you had this machine that would literally cut the tape, right? And then you could overlap and fuse together. So that's what we mean by a splice, all right? So let's look at that again. Joey went to the grocery store, okay, comma, he needed to buy eggs for supper. So you can't do that. Joey went to the grocery store. That is what we call, okay, lecture 2, an independent clause. That's a sentence. It stands on its own. Joey went to the grocery store. Period. There's your answer. He needed to buy eggs for supper. Okay? That's another independent clause. So watch out for that. Okay? Watch out when you try and fuse two sentences together. The sentence, okay, Joey went to the grocery store, and he needed to buy eggs for supper, they're both complete sentences. So instead, you would have to separate them with a period. All right? Now, that doesn't happen quite as often as it would when you're using introductory words or phrases. That's when we tend to get into trouble. And so, if you have a sentence, okay, sentences that are joined with however, therefore, furthermore, that's quite often where we'll find comma splices. Where we simply have commas, where probably we should have separated and had two sentences. There's the best advice I can give you right there. All right? So again, watch out for those introductory words or phrases. Remember, always make sure they're at the beginning of your sentences. Chances are you'll eliminate a lot of these problems. I'm going to do a couple more things with you here, but that's the best rule that I can give you. All right? Okay? Why am I pointing at you now? All right? Anyway, okay. And so I'm not going to do the whole thing with you, but basically there's 5 different ways that we can fix comma splices. The key, though, see, it's interesting. I'm going to give you these 5 ways to rehabilitate comma splices, but the crucial part is, how do you catch them? And that's not and there's no, as I said, there's no easy way for me to explain that, right? Because, as I said, each sentence, the construction of every sentence will be different. So, but as I said, but when we do catch them, when we see, especially with those introductory words or phrases, well, then at least we have 5 ways we can fix them. 4 really, because one of them has to do with the semicolon, and you can see in the notes, right, I have a whole lot of question marks beside that one. But anyway, so let's go back and take a look at the first example that we had. Joey went to the grocery store, period. Okay, he needed to buy eggs for supper. Okay, period. So we can when we catch a comma splice, instead we put a period, right? And then we move on with a new sentence. But I think you'll agree it creates what we would call choppy language, okay? Choppy writing. And so there's other ways we can do it as well, all right? So let's take a look now at number 2. We can replace it with a semicolon. I already showed you that when we looked at however. Remember? Okay, so it is true we can replace it with a semicolon. I would rather, when I say I would rather, I think if you want to become a really good writer, you really want to avoid the semicolon. You want to find different ways of creating sentences rather than having to rely on, boy, I'm just going to say it, okay, lazy punctuation. That's the way I would refer to it, okay? All right, and even there, right? No, in my notes there, okay, avoid them, and I've got an exclamation mark and all that. Anyway, okay. Now, we can also connect with conjunctions, right? And there are a variety of conjunctions. Don't worry too much about that right now, but you know the words. You know the word. If we have a coordinating conjunction, the most common coordinating conjunction is simply the word and, right? So, each of those words implies a kind of relationship, right? You've got and, you've got but, all those types of words, okay? But again, yeah, don't worry too much about that, all right? Okay, I've got an example there for you, though. Joey went to the grocery store, okay? Okay, for some reason I have Joey went by the grocery store. I think that was a mistake, but anyway, okay? But he forgot to buy eggs for supper. Yeah, but there's a much better way of doing it, right? Much better way. Let's take a look at number 4. Number 4 is even better. So we can replace the comma with what we call a subordinating conjunction. Again, I'm not going to test you on anything like that, like language when it comes to subordinating and coordinating and all that, but I will elaborate on those ideas when we get to, and I can't remember right now off the top of my head, I think it's lecture 9 or 10, right? I'll elaborate a bit more on that before we get to the final paper, all right? So for now, and I've given you a whole lot of different examples of subordinating conjunctions, okay? But basically, when we have a subordinating conjunction, usually what happens is you have a dependent clause, okay, a group of words that stand on their own. Then you also have a dependent clause, and they're connected by one of the words that I have listed for you there, right? So dependent clause, remember we talked about that? A set of words that don't stand on their own. I think, yeah. Let's look, instead of me explaining all the terminology, look at the example, number 4, okay? Joey went to the grocery store because he needed to buy eggs for supper. So think about it for a moment. If that sounded a bit confusing, well, Joey went to the grocery store. Okay, that's a sentence that stands on its own, right? But then look at because he needed to buy eggs for supper. Well, that is a clause. It's a group of words, but it's not a complete sentence. That's all we mean by this whole idea of subordinating. And I will elaborate. I'll elaborate. Subordinating simply means working on 2 different levels. You've got your dependent clause, and you have your independent clause, and you have your dependent clause. That's all subordinating means. Okay? Don't confuse yourself. Don't worry about it. Like I said, I'm not going to test you on that, right? But you'll see more as we move along. Okay? When we get to more sophisticated writing. Remember, we're just getting ready for the first paper. That's all we're doing. Okay? So. And I think I will, after I do the rest of these, before we get into the works cited, I think I will take a tiny break. Just a couple of things I want to check, all right? And so, or a different example, yeah, Joey went to the grocery store, comma, although he forgot to buy eggs for dinner. So again, Joey went to the grocery store, independent clause. I don't know why I keep doing that. Independent clause. Although he forgot to buy eggs for dinner, dependent clause. And so remember, I talked a tiny bit, okay, about how all that stuff works early on in lectures. But that's it. That's it. And then finally, we could do, okay, a transitional word, right? But that's where it gets a bit tricky. So again, and I showed you this. This is going to connect back to the comma rules. So you need to place a semicolon. If you're going to use a traditional transitional word like however or whatever, then you have to have the semicolon, right, or a period, right, followed by the transitional word and then a comma. It's all there in the notes. All right. And so that it does get complicated, right, as we already looked at. And so I don't want to confuse you, all right? So let's just keep this simple from now. But there is one last thing that I thought maybe, one last thing that I thought maybe we could talk about, okay? Take a look at, on page 5, okay? Justin is a great chef. His apartment is a mess. And so in an example like that, right, we have what we call two independent clauses. Both those sentences are correct. They're fine. But again, they're kind of choppy. I think you would agree, right? It's just like, Justin is a great chef, period. His apartment is a mess, period. Like chop, chop, chop. That's what I mean by choppy, okay? If I write choppy writing on your essay, that's all I mean, right? And so, how could we maybe make this flow a bit better? Well, there's two different ways, depending, at least for this example, two different ways depending upon our meaning. So let me show you. Justin is a great chef, okay, but his apartment is a mess. So in that regard, two different things working at the same time, right? He's great at one thing, but, and then we need the comma. Remember going back to the comma rules? That's comma rule number 1, right? So Justin is a great chef, comma, but, okay? And right away then, now we have a subordinating clause. Again, don't worry too much about that, but it simply means things are working on two different levels. He's a great chef on the one hand, but, right? Whereas in the second example, okay, Justin is a great chef and his apartment is beautiful. That's the way we separate or figure out the difference between coordinating, which would be the second example, and subordinating, which would be the first. Again, though, don't email me asking me to elaborate and explain. We'll get to it. We will get to it. I'm simply trying to show you for now how to connect, right? How do we connect? How do we get rid of comma splices? Okay? And so, in the first example, let's go back to the exact two that we were looking at. You could not write, okay, or at least you shouldn't. Justin is a great chef, period. But his apartment is a mess. No, that's not very good style, right? So instead, you would have a comma and then but, right? And again, and so working on two different levels. Or in the second example, okay, where you have the word and, then you don't need a comma, and everything works together. All right? And so, as I said, comma splices, they're not easy. They are not easy to catch. So always a good example, okay, or a good idea, I should say, give your paper to someone else. Someone else will catch the mistakes, okay, far, far more readily than you will. And the opposite is true. You'll catch mistakes from someone else's writing that other person wouldn't catch. Again, because when we edit, we tend to start at the beginning and work through to the end, so it makes sense. It sounds right. Someone else will catch it, okay, if there is a mistake. So anyway, give me, well, it doesn't really matter, like I keep joking, right? I could be gone for 2 days, right? Whatever. But let me just pause for a second. And we're only going to talk briefly about the works cited, all right? All right. So, all I'm trying to show you here with the works cited, okay? This is on See You Learn, all right? And so, there's a separate sheet on See You Learn. So at the end of a literary essay, instead of having a bibliography, you have something called a works cited. It's really straightforward. It's almost exactly the same as what you were taught, okay? And so what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to show you the 3 most common texts, type of texts that you would need for a works cited. What I mean by that is, you might quote from a book, you might quote from a collection, okay, or like an anthology, and then you might quote from a journal article. Now, there'll be other things that you quote from as well, okay, like in your academic career, but for first year, chances are the 3 that I'm showing you, they'll be the most common. All right, okay, and ironically, I'm going to say something here which might surprise you. By the end of your university career, there's a very good chance you will not be quoting from books. And the reason for that? Books are far more general, okay, than say a journal article, right? Journal articles get much more specific. So you save a lot of time when you're going through a journal article. You save a lot more time reading a journal article than you would a book, obviously, right? So, and it's interesting because now with the library sources that we have, right? It's amazing what you can find in journals. It's amazing how quickly you can find stuff. So you'll want to refer then to the file that I sent on the library, okay? Library databases and all that. And again, I sent you, it's very general what I sent you, right? For reasons that I've already talked about, all right? Okay, so keep in mind, notice here where I have bolded the word books. You would not have that word in the actual works cited. I'm simply showing you this is how you do a book, this is how you do a collection, all right? So for a book, you'd have the last name of the person who wrote the book, obviously. And there's a reason why I'm saying that. You'll see in a moment. Then you have the first name of the person who wrote the book. Then you have the title of the book. And notice, the title of the book is italicized. That's the only time in an essay where we have italics, right? This is another thing that I've noticed. Students are being taught that they're supposed to italicize any information that's in a quotation in their essay. Don't do that, right? Remain in the same font, Times New Roman 12, throughout your entire paper. The only time you would italicize is the title of a book, okay? And the fact that you've italicized it tells me it's a book. As I said, you don't need to have the word books. I'll know it's a book based on the way you do the citation, okay? And so we'll go slowly with this, right? So works cited would be centered on a separate page at the end of your essay, okay? Then you would have the, like I said, title of the book, then you have the publisher, and then you have the year of the publication. That's it. So we used to include the city, right? But we don't anymore. And again, why? I have no idea. So someone arbitrarily decides these things, then we're supposed to follow the rules. I'm not kidding. I'm not joking. All right. So there it is. So here's an example. We have Gleek, comma, James, period. Then you have the title of the book. And then you have Penguin Books, in other words, the publisher, right? Comma, 1987. That's it. All right. Books are very straightforward when it comes to citations. Very straightforward. Now it gets a tiny bit more complicated when we actually quote from an anthology or a reference or a collection. So what I mean by that, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, but when you, let's just say you have a selection of 20 essays in one book, okay? 20 essays written by 20 different people, okay, or 20 different persons, I guess is the correct way of saying that. Well, then how do I cite that? Very simple. And I'm not even worried too much, there's a couple of other things I want to show you here which are far more important, okay, than the thought that I couldn't finish there. All right. Okay. So now we have last name, comma, first name, period. But last name, first name of whom? Remember, we have a book. There's 20 different essays in the book, all written by 20 different individuals. Well, in this case, if I was quoting from one of those essays, this will happen, by the way, like in your academic careers, so make a note of this one. You would actually have the last name and the first name of the actual person who wrote the essay in the book. So we're not worried about whatever names are on the cover of the book. You're actually quoting now from the essay itself. Okay? So you'd have the last name and the first name of the person who wrote the essay. Then you'd have the title of the essay in quotation marks. Then look back to the first example with number 1, a book. Then you would have the title of the collection, the title of the book. So, and the title of the book is in italics. So there's the difference now. When you set it up that way, I understand, okay, title of the essay, very straightforward, right? In other words, that's inside the book itself. Title of the collection, that's obviously the information on the cover, on the outside. So that's how you make the differentiation between the two. And then you would literally write edited by, and then you would give the editor name, okay, or names. And interestingly enough, again, this is a bit of a change. We used to do EDS, right, in parentheses, editors, right, EDS. Now you actually write edited by, okay, in MLA. And then the publisher's names, it's actually first name, last name, okay, rather than at the beginning where you have last name, first name. When you write the editor's names, it's first name, last name. So as I said, that may pop up in this course. I don't know if it will, okay? But it probably will down the road. So it's something to hang on to, right? Again, I've got the file for you on CU Learn, okay? And you have it here in your notes, but as I said, not a bad idea just to create a separate file. And then you have the publisher, and then you have the year, okay? And then you have something called the page range. So now let's flip to page 6 for me to explain the page range, all right? And it's very, very straightforward. So you've got all the information there on page 6, and there's two things I want to point out. First, okay, on the first line, everything is left-hand justified. Okay, like your first line in a works cited is always left-hand justified. And then if your citation runs more than one line, then you indent. Each successive line will be indented. Then you only, and by the way, notice it's double-spaced. Everything in the paper is double-spaced. Then, when you get to the next citation, let's just say you have more than one citation, okay, some of you will, some of you won't, then you would simply double-space again, so you don't want a big space in between. You simply double-space, and then you do the next one, left hand, and then if you need more than one line, indent. That's it. So follow the way I've done this, okay? And then, as I said, the page range. So notice on page 6 where it says 24 to 34, all that means is, and remember that collection we were talking about that had 20 different essays? Well, if I'm trying to find, okay, the essay that you quoted from in your article, you're telling me that the essay actually starts on page 24 of the collection and runs to 34. That's it. All right? Pretty straightforward. And then, of course, you have the period. Finally, we have a journal, an online journal. So how would I quote from that? Well, very straightforward. Last name, first name of the person who wrote the journal article. A journal article quite often will be found within a larger collection. So, last name, first name of the person who wrote the journal article. Then you'd have the title of the article again, just exactly the way we looked at in the second example with collections. And then instead of the book title, you would have the journal name. And the journal name would be in italics. Okay, that's it. All right. Then you'd have the volume. Volume simply can mean two different things. Sometimes there'll literally be a volume number. Okay, volume 33. Like in other words, edition, right? Edition 33 or whatever. And so if that's the way the journal labels itself, you would simply put 33 there. Sometimes the journal will not have a volume number. Instead, Queen's Quarterly, put out by Queen's University in Kingston, right? They have spring, summer, fall, winter. So instead of the volume number there, you would simply put spring, okay, or whatever, right? Then you'd have the year, and then again you would have the page range. Okay, exact same idea that we just looked at in number 2. Now, in the Journal Online example, I also have this acronym, right? Letters that stand for words, and it says DOI. That means Digital Object Identifier. Okay? Don't worry for this course about that. Older articles, they don't even have these things. Some newer article, I'm not joking when I know how vague I'm sounding here. I'm not joking when I say, it's like some articles have a digital object identifier, some don't. So, yeah, I'm jumping just at the very end here. MLA now encourages the inclusion of a DOI if one is available. Like, how arbitrary is that? All right, but that's the rule. So again, Don't get hung up on that, all right? Don't lose sleep over, well, I don't have a DOI, or don't worry about it. But as I said, if you're doing this for other courses, notice the way I have it here. Let's just go through the example. We're almost done, all right? It took a bit longer than I thought. So we have Smith, Janice, right? So Janice Smith wrote the article, last name, first name. We have the title of the essay itself, okay? And then we have Dalhousie Review, and 33 was the volume number, and then the year. And then we have PP this time, okay? Oh, I didn't mention that with the other example. In the page range in MLA, we now include the small 2 P's, right, with a period. So just follow the example, okay? All right, and then we have the DOI. Boom, that's it. All right, and so a couple of last things. Every citation will end with a period, so it's all contained, right? And other than that, like I said, always just do your best when it comes to the works cited. Like it can get really complicated, you know, how we put these things together and all of that. So just do your best for now. And if you have questions, if there are other things, remember, where do we go to find answers to, right, the things that like the more sophisticated questions? Right? You just go to the OWL at Purdue. And as I said, it's an amazing website. I don't know how much you'll need it for this course. As I said, I think those are the 3 most common. But down the road, for your other courses, right, you may need to have answers to much more sophisticated questions. The OWL will have them. OWL has APA, MLA, and Chicago, everything else. But one last thing, okay, and then we'll call it a day, because there are 2 lectures today, right? There's another one that accompanies this. Just make sure you always do your best to show me where you took material from, all right? And I think that's good enough for now. There was one last thing. I can't remember if I mentioned this before. I did, but I'm going to mention it again. When you are writing your first essay, feel free, rather than using the editor and doing the collection and all of that, you can pretend that you're taking your information, like your first essay, let's just say, you can pretend that you're taking it from the Troll Garden, okay, Paul's Case, right, by Willa Cather. Yeah, in other words, don't worry about going to a collection and trying to figure out how to do all of this stuff, right? Pretend that it just came from a book, because that's all the information I gave you at the top, right? At the top of the actual short story. So just pretend that that's the book it came from. It is the book that it came from, but it would be more complicated if you actually looked at the edition, saw the editor, because there was other essays in there. Instead, go ahead. I mentioned this, I think, last lecture. Go ahead and just put Cather 22 when it comes to your quotes, and then just quote it as if it was a book at the end. I hope I didn't confuse you there. I think you understand what I'm saying there, right? Right? So make it simple on yourself. So other than that, yeah, I think we're going to call it a day. All right? So good luck with your papers, and we'll be in touch soon. Okay, bye.